Hello, welcome to Scott's Odyssey. All of history has a story, but not all stories have a history. Today, we're going to talk about one of those sites. This is the former site of the Huntingdon County hanging tree, or the last witch hanged in Huntingdon County story. See you in a minute. Welcome back. If you've watched my videos before, thank you for your patronage, and I hope you enjoy the story of the hanging tree in Huntingdon County, Pennsylvania. If you're new to Scott's Odyssey, welcome aboard, and please take a moment to click subscribe for more of this journey through ODDySEEy stories of who we once were. Although travelers were exploring and mapping the area of Huntingdon all the way back to 1754, it wasn't until 1768 that the area began initial settlement along these standing stone tracts of land sold by Reverend Dr. William Smith, an Episcopal priest from Aberdeen, Scotland, who was asked by Benjamin Franklin and Richard Peters to come to Philadelphia and teach at the newly established Colonial College, now known as University of Pennsylvania. A little bit of smoke. But we will save that story of Reverend Dr. William Smith for another episode. During the time of the settlement of this area, the attraction of religious freedom rang most true in the province of William Penn's Pennsylvania, later becoming the first Commonwealth of the United States shortly after the Revolutionary War. The first influx of immigrants seeking religious freedom were that of the Irish and the Germans, where Germans included Swedes and Finnish alike, shortly after the end of the War of Religion in Europe, known as the 30 Years' War. During the 1670s through the mid-1700s, we saw a boom of different Germanic, Dutch, and Nordic religions come to Pennsylvania, with everything from Mennonites and Dunkers to Schwenkfelders, Moravians, Waldensians, Lutherans, and other denominational Christianities. From the 1680s through the 1770s, the colony saw so many Irish immigrants that 1/3 of the population of all of Pennsylvania residents were Irish, and with them they brought the religions of Catholicism, Presbyterian, and other denominational Christianities. Likewise, during that same period, there was of course the English with their Puritan and Quaker beliefs. But wait, where are the witches? Well, that's where things get interesting. Keep watching to the end of the video to make sure you don't miss the history about this tree in the middle of the road. Witches, as you know them today, didn't exist until the 1900s. In the time of the 1600s through the 1800s, especially in Pennsylvania, with its religious freedoms, witches didn't exist in the way you might think. What did exist is the Christian belief, as set forth in the Old Testament, is of people who practiced witchcraft. Yes, the word witchcraft predates the word witch. Now, the people who practiced witchcraft in Pennsylvania were essentially almost every single non-denominational Christian religion. You heard that right. The manners in which witchcraft were practiced are found in the different methods used to practice their religions. The key ones that stand out are the holy or holy submersion of a person in water, such as practiced by the Dunkers. Likewise, those who use native and natural plants to create tinctures, teas, poultices, and other natural remedies when no doctor was available in order to cure ills. Additional practices of witchcraft were the imbuing of any form of anything with some God-granted superpower against evils, such as that of the hexes or wards, and even counter witchcraft such as balls or bottles, all of which are ultimately symbols of witchcraft. Witch balls are ornaments hung around your house or trees, like you do every year during Christmas, in order to banish or reflect jealousy and evil thoughts that people who visit you might have because of the things you possess that they don't possess, or the gifts that you've presented beneath your Christmas tree. In almost all of the German religions, there was some form of divination or runic rituals that were performed through the use of actual plant parts, rune symbolism, and the speaking of particular Bible verses in broken Latin. These practices were often called powwows. A powwow in Pennsylvania had nothing to do with the Native Americans and was a Dutch practice defined as a healing for physical and spiritual ailments. On the Irish side, most of what would be considered witchcraft was their Celtic or Druidic practices of herbal tinctures to cure an ailment or some odd practice with animals that would relieve an ill of said animal, which ultimately was just an early form of modern-day pharmacy and veterinary sciences. That brings us to the story of the last witch hanged in Huntingdon County. As the story goes, there was a woman who lived deep in the Huntingdon County woods who practiced witchcraft against anyone who would trespass on her land. One day, Farmer Brown's cows broke through his fence and ended up on this woman's property, and they ate all of her herbal garden. She went to Farmer Brown, and with her half-shut eye and crooked finger, she demanded reparation for the damage wrought upon her livelihood. Farmer Brown picked up his rifle and growled at the woman, "Begone, you hag, or I will remand you to the ground with your wicked plants." At this point, the woman placed a hex upon Farmer Brown's cows and chickens, which stopped them from producing milk and eggs. Farmer Brown, at the end of the week, having no milk and no eggs, gathered a group of people who went to the woman's home and burned it to the ground. They then dragged the woman to the only cedar tree in Huntingdon and hanged her until dead. That is essentially the story of the last witch hanged in Huntingdon. As great as a story it never happened. The first problem is Huntingdon didn't exist until 1787. And previous to that date, something very interesting happened in Pennsylvania. Keep watching. We're almost at the reveal of the facts surrounding this lone cedar tree. As a historic fact, 9 years before the Salem witch trials in 1683, 103 years before the founding of Huntingdon, Pennsylvania, there was a farmer along Ridley Creek in what is now Ridley Creek State Park, Delaware County, located down by Philadelphia, about 220 miles from here. His name was Henry Drystreet. Henry Drystreet, an English Puritan who had only recently moved to the New World, had an issue when his cows were no longer producing milk and some even died. Sound familiar? Just down the road a bit were another couple of well-established farms, Nils Mattsson from Sweden and Hendrik Jacobsen from Germany, whom had built their farms nearly 15 years before William Penn was even granted the land west and south of New Jersey known as Sylvania. And well, the Mattsons and Jacobsens, being early settlers and having best pick of the land, were doing very well for themselves and not suffering any issues with their cows or other livestock. The Finnish wife of Nils Mattsson, Margaret Mattsson, and the Finnish wife of Hendrik Jacobsen, Jethro Hendrickson, were both in a joint venture business of being traditional Finnish healers who cooperatively worked an herb garden. What one can only describe as jealousy or perhaps religious differences, it wasn't long before Henry Drystreet blamed his animals' issues on the fact that if his English animals were not doing well, then it must be from hexes placed upon them, which was a common belief of a Puritan. Through continued complaint about his animals and rumors being created, Margaret Mattsson and Jethro Hendrickson were arrested for witchcraft. Let me know in the comments below if you know of stories and locations such as the last witch hanged in Huntingdon or the hanging tree. My research is limited only by the information that people don't share openly. Help me break that barrier and let's share the history and culture of who we once were. The specific accusation was that both Margaret and Jethro put hexes and bewitched Henry Drystreet's livestock. The presiding judge of the arraignment put into place, for the first time in American history, the process of setting bail at 50 pounds each to ensure the woman would appear before the provincial council in 1683. Interestingly enough, the original presiding judge was a Quaker, and the process of having someone put forth a financial good faith bond was a common practice religiously. The bond would be fully refunded when the bond that the money was covering was completed. On December 27th, 1683, the chosen judge to preside over this particular case was none other than the Pennsylvania proprietor, William Penn, along with his attorney general, a grand jury of 21 members, and a petite jury of 12 composed of several Swedish and Finnish members for equality to the accused. The two presiding lawyers for the prosecution were both immediately barred from the courtroom. Because Margaret had difficulty with English, William Penn assigned an interpreter to allow Margaret to defend herself in court. Up to this point in time, it had never been heard of a woman being given the right to be in a courtroom or stand before a court or judge and permitted to speak, let alone defend themselves in a proceeding. Not only that, but because the women were not Puritan, William Penn did not force them to pay the 10% tithe required by all other colonies. The initially prescribed penalty for if these women were found guilty was death by hanging. Henry Drystreet testified against Margaret by stating he had heard that 20 years previous Margaret Matson was a practitioner of witchcraft and had bewitched other people's cows. Another man, Charles Ashcombe, took the stand and stated that Margaret Matson's daughter told him they sold their cattle because her mother, Margaret, had bewitched them, and in addition to that, the daughter claimed that there was an appearance of a bright light and a visage of an old woman standing at the foot of her bed while holding a knife. Anna K. Coolin testified that she and her husband were boiling the heart of a calf that they had believed had been affected by witchcraft. And Margaret entered their home and told them it would be better to boil the bones. Margaret's only defense was to deny the testimonies and call it hearsay. The jury were given charge to make decree on Matson. Their determination was that Margaret was guilty of the common fame of witchcraft, but not guilty in the matter of the form as she stands indicted. After the jury gave statement, William Penn asked pointedly to Margaret, "Art thou a witch?" And Margaret vehemently denied being a witch. Then William Penn asked, "Hast thou ever ridden through the air on a broomstick?" Confused by the question and in the way that it was translated to her, Margaret shook her head in agreement that she had. In the end, William Penn realized that this was an entire charade, but he still had to maintain law and order, so he quickly stated, "Well, I know of no law forbidding the riding on a broomstick. She had a perfect right to do so in this state." In the closing charge, and as directed by the jury, the verdict of Mary Matson was that she was indeed a witch, but not guilty of bewitching. Both Margaret and Jethro were released to their husbands with a posted bond of 50 pounds each that would be returned after 6 months of good behavior. This was the first and last trial of a witch in Pennsylvania. This was 103 years before Huntingdon ever existed. So if this tree was not a witch hanging tree, then what kind of hanging tree was it? Additionally, established law by William Penn dictated that the only manner in which someone could ever be hanged is if, without a reasonable doubt, someone premeditatedly took the life of another person. This was historically the first time the precedent was set that in order to be condemned to death, a person must have taken another life, not done it by accident, and had previously devised a way to take that other person's life. All three aspects to modern day legal convictions of the third degree of murder. As I've presented in one of my former videos, the very first person ever hanged in Huntingdon County was Robert McConaughey on Friday the 6th of November in 1840 for the familicide of the Browns. The only other person ever hanged in Huntingdon County was Frank Calhoun on May 8th, 1913, and he was the last person ever hanged in Huntingdon County before hanging itself was no longer practiced in the state of Pennsylvania. And for both McConaughey and Calhoun, the hanging took place in the county jailhouse. So what is the deal with this tree? Well, as I stated in the beginning of this video, all history has a story, but not all stories have a history. Although this odd tree in the middle of the road has had many stories, its history is not as grandiose as we like to hear. John Simpson Africa, born in Huntingdon, was an entrepreneur, a statesman, and a civil engineer. One day he saw a beautiful and large cedar pine in the middle of the field along the road connecting Standing Stone to McAlevy's Fort. He decided to purchase and develop this section of land into a small community with a given name of Cedar Tree Development, where the tree would stand gloriously in the middle of the entrance, separating the in road from the out road. That, unfortunately, is the real story of the cedar tree. Since sometime after 1850 and into 2020, this cedar tree has stood in the middle of the road telling a history that turned into a story that became stories without a history for over 170 years. And now that storyteller has ended forever. During the week of June 21st, 2020, the tree was permanently removed pending new road paving. I hope you enjoyed this video on the hanging tree of Huntingdon County. Leave a comment below and send me any pictures you might have of this tree or other stories you've heard regarding the hanging tree. Remember to click like and subscribe to this channel for more ODDySEEy stories of who we once were. See you on the next adventure.